Good evening all, and welcome. I've just been handed a piece of paper from a ghostly hand, informing me that we have not managed to reach the 1,000 comment target. Please, let's try and hit that in tonight's video, or the ghosts may be paying you a visit. But without further ado, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. When I was 16, my friends and I had an apartment in the building his parents owned. It was an old building in Chicago and had hundreds of tunnels that Al Capone and company had built that his dad had blocked off. We used the roof as a place to go and smoke cigarettes. You had to go through the attic to get there though. There were no lights, so the only lights we had were from our crappy little brick/flip phones. One day, my friend Manny and I were going up to smoke. I told Manny I had to piss, so I did in the apartment. I went up and felt like there was someone there. It was pretty common for us to mess around with each other, so I said, "Manny, I know it's you. Stop mucking around." I followed this shadow figure thinking it was him. I yelled, "Stop playing, I know it's you," as I followed the figure. Then I heard from downstairs Manny say, "What?" I was terrified. I had just followed him to a corner. I ran back downstairs and asked if he was there. He was, talking to his girlfriend at the time, and I told him I didn't want to go upstairs. I know what I saw. People always try to say, maybe the shadow was your own. That's not possible, because I had a Motorola flip phone at the time, and I was only holding that in front of me. I saw a shadow person, and I know that others have as well. When I was 13, I experienced the ghost of my grandmother. She died in her sleep while taking a nap on the living room couch. Afterwards, according to my father and grandfather, every now and then they would hear her make the trip from the bedroom to the kitchen and open the refrigerator door, a trip she made many times when she was alive. At first I thought my father and grandfather were making this up, having fun at my expense. A couple of years after she passed away, my father and I went to spend the weekend with my grandfather. My father and I slept on the living room couch as it opened into a double bed, the same couch that my grandmother died on. My grandfather left the house to go to a next-door neighbor's house to play poker. My father and I went to bed in the living room. My father went right to sleep. I laid awake reading a magazine. After a while, I heard the noise of the back bedroom door being pulled open. I heard the sound of shuffling feet, and I heard the creak in the floor directly in front of the bathroom doorway. I heard more shuffling feet. Then I heard the fridge door being pulled open, and I heard the sound of glass bottles in the fridge door clinking against each other. Back then, they were still putting soft drinks in glass bottles. Feeling thirsty, I decided to get out of bed and go join my grandfather in the kitchen for a cold drink. I go into the kitchen, only to find myself alone. I was puzzled. I could have sworn I heard my grandfather walk from the bedroom into the kitchen, open the fridge, and then I remembered my grandfather wasn't home. He was over at the neighbor's house, and he hadn't come back yet. Then I remembered my grandfather and father's ghost stories. Then I got scared. I raced from the kitchen into the living room and leaped over my sleeping father into my side of the bed. Then I went to sleep. I don't know how long I slept for before I woke up with a start and a feeling of paralyzing fear in my body. I was frozen. I was lying on my right side, and it took a while for me to work up the courage to turn my head to my left. My head was covered by my blanket. There was a shadow being cast onto my blanket. The shadow was the outline of a head and shoulders of a woman with a beehive hairdo. My grandmother used to always have a beehive hairdo, even years after it went out of style, up until she died. I heard heavy breathing coming from the shadow. I had to work up the courage to move one of my hands to remove the blanket off my face. When I did, in an instant, the paralyzing fear was gone. The shadow was gone, along with the sound of heavy breathing. My father was still asleep. I pulled the blanket back over my head and went back to sleep, only to wake up again on my right side. The paralyzing fear was back. Forcing myself to turn my head, the shadow was back. The heavy breathing was back. And again I had to summon up all my courage to move my hands and to take my blanket off my face, only to find nothing there, and the paralyzing fear gone. I went through this same routine the entire night. I lost count of how many times this happened throughout the night. Maybe a dozen, maybe more, but it happened a lot. The next morning I told my father what happened to me throughout the entire night while he slept. The sounds of the bedroom door opening, the shuffling feet, the fridge door opening, and nobody in the kitchen. Being awakened with a paralyzing fear, the shadow, the heavy breathing, the repeat performances throughout the night. I kind of expected him to tell me that I was seeing and hearing things, but instead he smiled and exclaimed, "That was Grandma." I grew up in a one-room schoolhouse. My great-aunt's husband's family had owned the whole hillside, a massive farm, and what became my house had been grain storage, and then the schoolhouse. It shows up on a map in 1844. I haven't been able to track it beyond that. Anyway, when it was a school, one night, a young pupil tried to break in, probably part of a bet or dare from his friends. The window he'd pried open came down on his neck and broke it instantly. Many moons later, on my 17th birthday, I had 5 or 6 girls over for a party, and we got out the Ouija board. We immediately got a barrage of messages. I remember we had to grab a notebook because we couldn't keep up with all the letters. The board told us a story about a 12-year-old boy, and then said that the boy had always watched out for me, because my smile reminded him of his sister Gertie's smile. The board asked me to go into the library. It's just a walk-in closet where I keep too many books, nothing fancy, and asked me to open the window. I walked into the library and immediately got so scared I had to run back out. I researched my house for a school project soon after because I wanted details. The boy had died at aged 12, and his sister's name was Gertrude. Every time I grab a book, I apologize for not opening the window, but also, I'm really kind of mad at the boy/ghost, because if he's real, he said he'd watch out for me. But my mum was a mean drunk, and her paedophile boyfriend lived with us for 7 years. Honestly, I'm not entirely sure how much I really believe in any of it, but I always can't help but apologize to the boy who's in the library. My grandmother always claims the pub her and my granddad used to own was haunted. They lived in the house that came attached. One night, her and the kids went to bed early, while my granddad tended the bar to closing time. She heard chatting noises from the kitchen, and assumed it was him. The next morning she asked him what he was doing in the kitchen the night before to make such noise. He said he never went near the kitchen that night, and that he went straight to bed after closing. Another night, my uncle, who was a young child at the time, told my grandparents that he saw someone atop of the stairs in the house. They weren't the only ones to be creeped out. No one has owned the house for very long after selling it. My mum went there to visit it for the first time in years recently. The bar owner said none of the staff will stay late, because they have claimed to see strange things, or felt things that are weird. The owner herself won't live in the house, because it creeps everybody out. When I was really little, small enough my feet didn't touch the floor when I sat on a chair, I used to stay with my grandparents on the weekends. My grandma did the routine of going to the toilet before I was put to sleep, and she walked off to finish preparing the hot water bottle. I was sitting there singing and looking at my feet swaying off the toilet. When I looked up, there was a pale older woman standing a couple of feet away smiling at me. I wasn't scared, just confused. She seemed lovely. I didn't remember how she disappeared, but I remember she was really pale. Like everything was a shade of rosy white. As typical grandparents do, all but essential lights were off, so the hallway leading off the toilet was quite dark. But I remember, it was like she was standing in her own soft light. My aunt had passed that year, and I'd only met her a few times in my short life. I'm not actually sure if we were related or not, but she just adored me. She was a very vivacious woman even at 80. She'd embraced the 60s and refused to act her age. I think maybe it was her, or the echo of her saying goodbye. Strange little memory. It could have been a dream, but it feels quite real. In 2002, I lived in the East San Francisco Bay Area with my husband and 2 toddlers. I was grieving over the sudden death of my mother a month before. She'd had a major heart attack and died at 52. On an average day, I left my babies at home with my husband to run a quick errand by myself. I drove a block over through downtown Hayward to hit up the grocery store. I was on my way home and stopped at a red light, waiting to make a left turn. The intersection had all blind corners, so it was difficult for me to see oncoming cars. The light turned green. I glanced both ways, waited for the appropriate second, and stepped on the gas pedal. It would not move. I tried again. Nothing. The car behind me honked. I looked down at my pedals quickly to see if something had possibly rolled under the pedal, and found nothing. I looked up, and suddenly a huge work truck loaded down with equipment and ran his red light at what must have been 50 miles an hour. I was stunned. I gasped, quickly pulled myself together, and stepped on the gas pedal, and it worked without no hesitation. Suddenly, I smelled my mother's favorite perfume. It was a really amazing experience. When I was young, I was on the bottom bunk and used to see legs walking parallel to my bed. This didn't happen often, only about twice a year. I would just scrunch my eyes shut and eventually roll over. After this happened for years, I was promoted to the top bunk and would now see the top of a grey head walking up and down. I told my parents what was happening, and as normal, they explained I was half asleep. When I was 14, I stopped seeing this man, but would hear really deep breaths right next to my ear. I was in a room on my own at the time, and would hold my breath, thinking it were me. Once my mum walked in while this was happening, and I flipped. I asked her to listen for the breathing, but it just stopped. After she left, it came back stronger. When I was 20 odd, I spoke to my mum, about what used to happen, and she said on multiple occasions she would see shadows walk into my room, and then I would whimper or run to her bed. When she came over to my bed, she had actually seen the shadow twice, and that's why she came, making my skin crawl just writing this, and I'm 24 years old now. Before my brother was born, we moved in with my gran into her house, which was my mother's childhood home, and she had 3 spare rooms, and we were about to overgrow our current house. A good few years on from that, my brother and sister, who were about 5 and 8 respectively, were both asleep in the room they shared, and I went in, opened their window as it had been a really hot day, and being in the UK, we don't have aircon. A good few hours later, I came back into the room, as I figured it might have gotten cooler, and I didn't want my bro and sis being too cold. I gently woke up my sister, asking if she wanted me to shut the window, and that's when the bedroom light flicked on. I didn't think much of it, shut the window, and the light flicked on again. That's when I thought it was a bit odd, as I've seen lights flicker off and on while switched on, but never while they were switched off. The next day I mentioned it to my mother, and her face went chalk white. Her brother, my uncle, died in that room of an asthma attack, and she desperately tried to save his life that night. Unfortunately, to no avail. But the night of the flickering light was the same day as the anniversary of his death. It never freaked me out, but I found it quite comforting that he's watching over us. When I was younger, my family went on holiday to Turkey for a week. At the end of the week, we were asked to move rooms, due to our other room technically now being rented out by someone else. No problem with that at all. We moved to an unused room at the back of the hotel for the night, and we didn't unpack. We were leaving in the morning, so there'd be no point. After a few hours, I wake up needing the toilet, but I have this horrible feeling in my gut, the kind that feels like your stomach's been flipped and dropped a few times. My bladder is close to bursting though, so I push through it and stand to go to the bathroom. That's when I see him. A boy, small and dirty, wearing old-fashioned clothes which looked ragged and torn, is standing in the middle of the corridor just staring at me. I've never felt so frightened as I did then, when the world feels wrong. He didn't move or talk. He just stood and stared at me from underneath a flat cap. I'm pretty much shaking in fear and completely disregard my bladder to slowly sit back down and pull the blanket over myself. I peek. He's moved closer. I didn't fall asleep until a good while later, when my mum got up to go to the toilet. I asked her if she saw anything, and when she confusedly said no, I explained to her what had happened. I don't remember much apart from the boy in the night, but whenever it comes up, she always says that she never saw me so scared, and that she believes it happened because of my reaction. Not so spooky, but definitely frightening to a 12-year-old. Side note, the apartment we went to for the night overlooked a single house-walled complex, which had armed security guards and patrols every few hours. Black cars would pull up with old men in business suits. We waved to the guards and they waved back. It was friendly enough, but certainly dodgy. I grew up in a small town in Texas. By small, I mean it takes less than 5 minutes to drive through. It is most certainly a place where everyone knows everyone else, because they all grew up together. I was very close with my grandfather. He would come by my parents' house and pick me up, and take me on trips to various different properties he had cows and such at. I would get to help feed them. There was one particular field he rented that was behind this old and abandoned rock house. While he was finishing up, I would swing on the outside of this gate facing towards the house. There was a screened-in porch within my vision, and apparently I saw a man through it staring at us. I can still remember that I instantly did not like him, and I had no idea why, but I wanted him to leave. I said, "Paw, who's that man?" and pointed towards the porch, but of course he was gone. He, oddly enough, was not skeptical at all, and just asked me to describe him. As I got older, my parents and I were sitting around talking, and the subject came up. My dad said that my grandpa told him I saw Harold, something or other, who my grandpa knew and had also lived in that house. He had killed himself on that porch a couple of years before that. In high school, I was over at my then boyfriend's house. He was the oldest of 5 kids. We were told by his little sister, who was probably around 9 or 10 at the time, that there was a family that used to live in that house, and that they were all murdered. That she could talk to them sometimes. We thought she was just making stuff up, and humoured her, and always changed the subject. One day at school, we saw our classmate drive his beat-up old Toyota over the grassy divide to avoid sitting in parking lot traffic. My boyfriend and I joked the entire way home that Yota found his own way out. We walked into his house, and his little sister was sitting in the kitchen. She was quiet for about 10 minutes or so and says, Mark, the boy ghost, went to school with you today." We rolled our eyes and muttered something along the lines of, "Someone forget their crazy pills?" She replied, "He said something about Yoda's way out. What does that mean?" And my boyfriend and I sat there with our mouths dropped open. No one else was in the car with us, and we went straight from the car to his house. A few weeks later, we were spending a weekend outside washing my car, and the kids were out with us. A huge flash of light happened, and this was a bright sunny day, and it wasn't a mirrored car drive-by or anything. And his little sister looks up at the sky and says, "The ghosts went home," and we never heard another word about any of it again. Still creeps me out. My mother kept children in our home. There was a toddler she kept named Josh. One afternoon, while his mother picked him up, she asked my mother if she could talk to her. She said that Josh had been waking up screaming at night, and they didn't know what to do. She said they would go into his room, and he would be screaming about the boy, who was making mean faces at him and scared him. He would point to the corner of the ceiling of his room. My mum told him it was probably just night terrors, and said that he would grow out of them. A few days later, when they brought Josh over, his hand was bandaged. The mother told my mother that Josh had been playing in the toy box when the top slammed on his hand. She said it was very odd, because the toy box lid had been laying all the way back on chain hinges, and she didn't understand how it came all the way forward from that position and slammed on his hands. That Monday, she told my mum and I something that gave us chills. She said that on Friday evening she was sitting on the chair sorting through pictures, and Josh was looking at them with her. He suddenly became hysterical and began crying and screaming, "The boy! The boy!" She said he was pointing to a specific picture. The picture was of the boy's big sister. She was born with health problems and died before he was born, when she was 7. The mother was looking at pictures because it was the 5-year anniversary of the little girl's passing. One of her health problems was encephalitis, and because she had to have shunts, her hair was kept short, making her look a bit like a boy. She said it all made sense. In the corner of the ceiling where he pointed and yelled, "The boy," each night he woke up screaming, and there on the shelf was a stuffed toy that had belonged to his sister. The toy box he played in that had slammed on his hand also belonged to his sister. She said they had not told him about his sister yet, because they felt that he was too young to understand her death. They said that they immediately moved the stuffed toy out of his bedroom. They put it in the toy box, and they put the toy box in the attic. The past 2 nights since, he has slept peacefully. I share the room with my sister. My sister's bed was against the wall that had the door on it. Next to her bed was the PC and window, which were between our beds. So my bed was in one corner and the door in the other. I've heard many strange noises and possibly saw something after moving into this house. But what was even weirder was that for a few months I always woke up to nightmares either at 11, 1 or 3. One night, I had a recently creepy dream. The atmosphere was foggy and green, and it was eerie silent, with no one else around. We went to a flat where my grandmother lives. My cousin, sister, other grandma and I were looking for my mum. When we found her, we started walking and I was behind. This beautiful woman floated by us smiling, while carrying a baby in her arms. I knew she wasn't human. I turned after we passed by. She looked at me then as well. Then suddenly a man appeared from the edge of my vision. My brain told me that the stranger in my dream was my dad, and that he'd abused and killed that lady. They both started coming towards me. Then I woke up. I checked the time, 1 a.m. For some reason all I could do was stare at the corner of the open door. After a few minutes, a lady floated past the door away from my room. It still seemed like she was carrying something in her arms. Oddly enough, I didn't feel scared. I just kept staring at the door until I fell asleep. From then on, all the creepy things stopped. When I was about 11 or 12, I used to go on bike rides around the neighborhood. In the middle of our space, there was an old farmhouse with a barn in the back, right smack dab in the middle. Like they wanted to build the neighborhood, and whoever owned it was stubborn and didn't want to sell, so they built around it. I used to see this house, and as adventurous as I was during the early years, never ventured further than the bottom of the driveway, and sometimes would just look at it, wondering about its secrets and why it was there. On one particular day, I was at the end of the driveway looking at the house. I came upon a group of children, all about 2.5 years of age. Nothing out of the ordinary, right? Except the more I looked, the more they looked the same. I remember very distinctly, and always have, all the same age little boys with red hair, freckles, all dressed the same, wearing bibs with red and yellow striped shirts. A couple of them were on big wheels, while others were talking to each other. A couple of them were looking at me curiously. There were around 8 to 10 of the same looking children. I found this kind of odd, but wasn't scared. I was just wondering why no adults were around, why the front door was shut, and why there were no signs that life had been there in a while. No car, no nothing. Just the children. After contemplating this for a while, I rode away, not thinking too much about it. The next few weeks, I decided I would try to talk to them, but every time after that there'd never be anyone there. It wasn't until around 2 years later, when I thought about how completely and utterly terrifying this was. The house has been since torn down some years ago, and I got some serious chills recounting this. It's been a long time. When I was a kid, my room used to be across from our bathroom. One night, I saw something peek out the door and wave at me. I vividly remember this. I never took my eyes off the door while I screamed. My dad took me into the bathroom after he looked himself and showed me nothing was there. I never took my eyes off the door for a second. I remember that part very vividly. I've had nightmares about the thing that waved at me for almost 20 years now. I moved so many times from being in the army and pursuing other job opportunities, but I occasionally see it out of the corner of my eye. I've even seen it now where I live. I can perfectly describe it to you. Loose white skin, dark pants, no shoes, and looks like a mummy without wrappings. Empty eye sockets and weird, crazy spiked hair, kind of like a troll doll. For a reference, picture the cover of Iron Maiden's Iron Maiden album and replace the eyes with empty sockets. This is what has been scaring me since before I was in kindergarten. I could be crazy. It could have been a really bad nightmare that I had as a kid that traumatized me. But even so, I should not be seeing it when I'm fully conscious, right? I've actually searched a lot of shows I used to watch before the incident, and the only thing I can come up with as being the source of my nightmare is Billy from Hocus Pocus, which is my all-time favorite Halloween movie. I so want it to easily be explained as a Hocus Pocus dream gone wrong, but I seriously can't get over the fact that I'm still seeing it on occasion. If anyone has any theories or questions, I'm always willing to discuss with anyone who can take it seriously. I was once doing a charity event in high school, where we went to a local mansion. Think of a tiny version of Biltmore, and had scripted scenes in a designated room. We would dress up in clothes that the former house tenants would have worn, and pretended to be the people that used to live in the house. Earlier that week, I had been helping set up the house with decorations, and asked one of the people that tends to the house if there were any ghosts. Her response was, "We do have ghosts, but they're nice. If we change something in the room and they don't like it, they'll change it back overnight. There are times where we change the comforters on the beds, and we come back a few days later, and there's an indentation where it looks as if someone has been sitting on the edge of the bed, but no one has had access to get into the house." So on the night I was helping out, I proceeded to ask if there were any ghosts in the room that I was in with my brother and another person helping out. I looked around and nothing happened. Then I see my brother's face go white, and the person that was with us pointed behind me, and the door to an old armory had swung pretty violently open. The handle to the door to the armory had been taken off, and there was a piece of paper shoved between the two doors to keep the armory closed. I thought for sure the logical explanation was that the piece of paper had fallen to the floor and swung open because of it. However, when we tried to make the door swing open after putting the paper back, we couldn't get it to budge at all, much less fly open as it had. My parents love antiques. I never really cared for them much, because they never allowed me to touch anything when they brought me shopping with them, so I was always bored. Anyway, a few years ago my mum brought an old Irish teacher's desk in an antique store. It was big. You had to stand behind it to use it, or have a very tall stool, and it was made entirely of wood. I hated it. It creeped me out for some reason, and I still can't explain it. It just gave me a bad vibe. Of course, nobody listened, and she bought it anyway, and used it as her new home office desk. The desk is now in the basement, but used to be in what now is the dining room, where we have enormous mirrors hanging on the wall. The dining room has no wall separation from the piano room, which also has no wall to separate it from the front door. Next to the front door, with no barriers to block it from the large mirror, is yet another mirror, but round and normal sized. Both of the mirrors are antiques and for decoration. One day I was home by myself. It was morning, sun up, but the sky was grey, so it wasn't bright. I walked into the piano room to practice, and looked up to my right and saw a person standing in front of the desk. She was wearing a long, pale-coloured pleated dress with dark boots. When I lifted my head, she disappeared. But in the mirror, the larger one, I could see someone behind me in the reflection of us, in the smaller mirror just standing there. Of course, nobody was there when I turned around, but it scared the shit out of me. And to this day, while practicing piano, I see figures darting out of my sight in the mirror, and often hear loud noises accompanying them. It happened again today, in fact. I was practicing piano when a figure formed to my left. I looked up, and something in the mirror had moved. Same with the other mirror when I looked. And when I stopped, there was a loud bang. I really don't believe in ghosts, but I don't not believe in them either. There's a dog that my boyfriend sees randomly, and it travels from house to house with us. The first time it happened, we were staying at his dad's house for a bit after we moved to his hometown. We were just getting ready for bed, and I see him stop suddenly before getting in. He starts walking around to my side of the bed, saying something like, "Bella, what are you doing here?" That's one of his dad's dogs. He gets to my side, and I'm looking around confused, since the door was shut, and both dogs had been in the living room when I headed in. He swears he saw her. About 30 minutes later, we're both in bed just chatting about the day, and suddenly there's a distinct clicking of toenails on the wood floor going across the room. My boyfriend jumps up, turns the light on, then opens the door to the hallway and searches both side rooms next to ours. He comes back and says that 2 dogs are in the master bedroom passed out. We're both a little creeped out. He saw it 2 more times while we were there, but we just chalked it up to us seeing his dad's golden lab / boxer mix Bella sneaking around the house. The odd thing was, after we moved, it showed up several more times. We'll hear the clicking of toenails, huffing, and he'll see its shadow or a dog walk by the bedroom, from the kitchen or the living room. We have dogs of our own, but there have been times when they're sitting there with us by the couch, and we'll hear those noises, and they'll be in their kennels for bed, and he'll still see it walk by. The dogs don't seem to be too bothered by it, but they'll track something with their eyes, or they'll run to the other room to investigate something that we didn't hear. It doesn't seem mean, and I've gotten used to it, but still kind of creepy when you're home alone and hearing things. Stationed in Erlangen, Germany, between 1990 to 1993. But I lived off post in Nuremberg. I lived in a condominium off Düsseldorf with my then wife and 2 daughters. My oldest daughter was 3 at the time, and would often come running into our bedroom crying and complaining of a monkey in her room. She didn't have any toys of monkeys or apes, so it was kind of baffling to understand her on her fear. Their bedroom and ours were across from each other between the hallway, and we could see directly into their bedroom from ours. One late night, sitting up in bed reading, I caught movement out of my right side. Thinking one of my kids may be up, I walked to their room, but they were both asleep. I go back to my bed and book, and again I notice movement. So I glanced over to their room from my bed, and that's when I saw what appeared to be the outline of a child as it walked into the bedroom where my daughters were asleep. I launched out of my bed and covered the distance between my room and theirs in maybe 4 leaps. Nothing. My daughters were both sleeping. This was mid-tour for me, so for the remaining year and a half, we all slept in our room. Probably about 8 months ago, I had been living in this apartment that weird things were happening in. Doors opening in front of me, strange noises and whatever, and it was my first time living alone. But I had just left an abusive relationship, so I was just happy to be on my own. One night after a long shift at the hospital, I was laying down in bed with my dog curled up at the end. He's a big lab mix that is always goofy and friendly. Not so much a guard dog as I'd hoped, so I can keep a pistol on my nightstand and the hallway light on, which gives a faint glow into my room. I passed out pretty quickly from exhaustion, and knowing I had to be back up for work at 6 a.m. The next thing I know, I'm being woken up by a low, creepy growl coming from my dog. He never growls. For a few seconds I'm frozen. I feel like my heart is pounding out of my chest. My eyes popped open, and I see a figure of a man standing over my bed. The worst part is he appears to be holding a woman hostage with one arm around her neck. I freak out, grab the gun, and aim it at the man, my arms shaking. I don't remember if I said anything to him, but as I pulled the gun, he drags the woman through the wall. At this point I can't breathe. I'm fully alert and awake. I bolted out of my house with my pup and drove to a friend's house for the night. I now have a roommate and never told her about the weird stuff, and a couple of days after moving in, she asked if I had ghosts or something, because something kept switching her fan to off in the middle of the night, and random stuff like that. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed tonight's ghost stories, always some of my favourites. If you like this, comment. Let's get to 1,000. Drop a like, because, that's really nice, and subscribe, and press the bell icon to be updated every time I post with new nightly spooks. From the poll I put out earlier, it's good to see that you wouldn't mind some road rage stories and car chase stories. I think that's a new topic. I don't think I've ever done that before, but I think it'll be fun, and hopefully you guys like it when it comes out in the near future. If there's a story that you would like to share, feel free to send it to my email or post it to my Reddit. Both are fine, but just be generous when it comes to your punctuation, paragraphing, and descriptions, as a good description makes for a better story generally. But anyway, for now guys, I'm going to sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.